Hi everybody, this is the Exam 1 review video. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to give you actual questions that I have given in a previous exam. There are 50 of them. If you get the question right, you'll go on and go to the next question. If you get it wrong, then you'll go to a portion of the video where I describe what the correct answer is, and then it'll take you back to the questions. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it and start with question number 1. Number 1. Okay, learning theory is the one where people do things based off of rewards or punishments. So they have to basically start with doing something random, and then they get rewarded for it, they do it again, they get punished, they don't do it again. So you're looking for something where they basically were acting randomly first, and then they either got rewarded or punished. Number 2. According to sociocultural theory, people wear hats because culture, social norms. We're looking for something that is normal for them to do. A cultural norm is what you're looking for in this particular case. That's the sociocultural theory. The social cognitive theory is when you're planning ahead, when based off of your beliefs, based off of what you expect. That's the social cognitive theory. Question 3. People wear hats according to evolutionary theory. The evolutionary theory has 2 parts to it. The first part is you do things because you want to survive individually. The second part is you do things because you want to reproduce, pass on your genes. So both being attracted to mates, that is evolutionary theory, and keeping you warm so you survive, both of those are correct. Question 4. All right, now in this particular case, what's going on is my son is learning how to go potty, right? And he accidentally did touched the does it automatically first time he uses the potty, he's unaware of what he's doing. He grabbed the metal pipe. Yeah, so he grabbed the metal pipe and pulled on it. He thinks that pulling on the pipe causes the reaction, causes the flushing to happen, when in reality that's not what's going on. So in this particular case, the flushing is a reinforcement, and the grabbing of the pipe is not what's being reinforced, even though he thinks it is. Therefore, grabbing the pipe and expecting it to make the flush, that's a superstitious behavior. A superstitious behavior. It's what you think is going on when in reality it's not. Question 5. The American Psychological Association talks about psychology in the ABCs. A, affect. B, behavior. C, cognition. Affect means feelings, feeling states. So affect means feeling states. That's why the A, affect, means feelings. Number 6. The ideal way to establish a classically conditioned association is with forward short delay pairings. The Garcia effect, though, is an example of classical conditioning where you can have it happen with a backwards long delay. So forward short delay has to do with when you're presenting a neutral stimulus compared to when you're presenting the conditioned stimulus. Okay, so unconditioned stimulus. I mean, so what we're talking about here is like in Pavlov's dog, the neutral stimulus was the bell, the unconditioned stimulus was the meat powder. And if you want to think about it, forward is alphabetical order, neutral then unconditioned. So bell, meat powder, then the drools. Bell, meat powder, drools. So the pairing is forward if the neutral stimulus, the bell, comes before the unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder, right? The short delay means there's a very short delay, like we're talking seconds at the most. That's a short delay. A backwards pairing would mean that you would do the unconditioned stimulus first, then the neutral stimulus. That's backwards. A long delay means more than a few seconds would be a long delay. 7. Loftus and Palmer in 1974, this is where they had the car crashing into each other. They showed everybody the same video, And then they said how fast were the cars going when they either bumped into each other or crashed into each other, that one. This is, what they're saying is that the independent variable, the word that they use, like crashed versus bumped, right, changes the accessibility of a specific schema, right? When you think of smash, it's a big violent crash, okay? Whereas bump is just it's bump. The schema of crash or smash is a lot different than the schema of bump, okay? And so what's going on is that they are getting a different accessibility of different schemas based off of the words. Question 8. Which of these is most related to cognitive accessibility? Availability heuristic is most related to cognitive accessibility because availability heuristic means how available something is. The heuristic is you make a decision based off what comes to your brain the fastest, meaning what's most available or what's most accessible in your brain. All right? Cognitive accessibility is why availability heuristic works. Number 9. All right, we're going to do some reinforcement schedules here. So, a variable ratio reinforcement schedule means that we are giving a specific reinforcer based off of behavior. The ratio means that we're giving the reinforcer based off of the behavior. Okay, now in this particular situation, barking on cue is the behavior that I want. All right, and the dog treat is the reinforcer. I give the reinforcer based off of, according to ratio, it's got to be based off of the behavior, barking on cue. All right, so what makes it variable, though, is that it's not every 5th time he barks, I give him a dog treat. Bark, 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 dog treat. Bark, 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 dog treat. That would not be a variable, that would be a fixed ratio. This is asking for a variable ratio, so when you give a dog a treat for barking on cue, sometimes he only has to bark once, other times he has to bark as many 8 or 10 times. That is a variable ratio. Variable ratio reinforcement schedule. Number 10, variable interval reinforcement schedule. You're not giving the reinforcement based off of how many instances of the behavior, right? It's not based off of how many times he barks, for example. In this case, it's based off of time. Interval means time. What makes it variable is that the time varies. So you give your dog a treat for sitting and waiting patiently before crossing the road. Sometimes he has to wait a couple of seconds. Other times he has to do as long as 3 minutes. The time, a couple of seconds versus 3 minutes, that makes it interval. Because the time varies, it's a variable interval. If it was exactly 2 minutes every time, that would be a fixed interval reinforcement schedule. Number 11. Okay, young children sometimes bite when frustrated in order to reduce biting. So first of all, we already know that this is punishment because we want to reduce the behavior of biting. What do? Well, I'm going to respond to every single bite by taking away all of their toys, attention, etc. Taking away is negative. So I am using negative punishment to reduce this behavior. You're taking away something, that's negative. To reduce a behavior, that's punishment. That makes it negative punishment. 12. Young children sometimes bite when frustrated, same situation as before. Okay? I'm using negative punishment to reduce the behavior, and I'm using what kind of schedule? I'm using a continuous schedule. And you're like, wait a minute, isn't that a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule? No, what makes something fixed ratio is you have several instances, right? In this case, continuous means every time they do the behavior, you always get the either reinforcer or punishment. So this is a continuous schedule because it's every single time. If it was every 3rd time or every 2nd time or every 20th time, that would be a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule. But this is continuous because it happens every time they do the behavior. Every time they do the behavior. 13. All right, you might often hear the claim that male children tend to be much more physically aggressive than female when playing. According to the social cognitive theory, this is because, now in this case, social cognitive means we have to think about cognitions that are driving the behavior. So in this case, males tend to be surrounded by toy weapons and violent superhero characters, and those objects in their environment make them more likely to think about cognition, social cognition, think about aggressive things. Think about aggressive things. Okay, so in this particular case, thinking about it, that's the cognitive part. That's the cognitive part. 14. You may often hear the claim, so this is the same scenario as the last time. According to the learning theory, learning has to do with rewards and punishments. So the answer is males are often rewarded for acting aggressively, like in full contact sports. So in this particular case, the first option, if you practice aggressive behavior, is more likely to survive. That would be evolutionary theory, also called the biosocial theory. B would be surrounded by weapons. That's the social cognitive theory. C, often raised to think about violent behaviors normal for boys. That is the sociocultural theory. D is learning theory, and E is evolutionary theory, because they're more likely to mate. 15. All right, so we're going to use this scenario in a couple of questions. I want to see if consuming caffeine causes people to think and behave angrily. So that's my hypothesis. I think that causing caffeine causes people to think and behave angrily. That's the hypothesis. So I get 200 Psych 100 students, and they either have to drink regular or decaf. Then I have them write an essay when they're treated rudely, and then I measure how much anger they express in their writing. Okay, when I read those essays, I am the researcher in this case. When I read those essays, I need to be blind to the status of the independent variable. The independent variable is how much caffeine they consumed, whether they were in decaf or normal coffee, right? If I know whether they were writing in, they had decaf or normal coffee, then I might unconsciously or unwittingly say, oh, well, this is more aggressive or this is less aggressive. In this case, I should be blind to the status of the independent variable. I should not know what condition they were in. I shouldn't know if they had decaf or normal coffee. 16. I want to see if consuming coffee, this is the same scenario from the previous one. I should be blind to the status of the IV. IV stands for independent variable in order to avoid the Rosenthal effect. The Rosenthal effect. The Rosenthal effect is when the researcher makes their particular they make their particular prediction happen, right? So for example, if I knew that I knew these essays came from the people who drank decaf, I might, even unconsciously rate those as less aggressive because I knew and I expected people in the decaf condition to be less aggressive. And I might rate the ones in the normal coffee as more aggressive just because that's my expectation. I need to be blind to that so that I don't do that, so that I don't have the Rosenthal effect. 17. I want to see if consuming caffeine causes people to think and behave angrily, right? So same hypothesis as we've been dealing with. I ran a study, and after looking at my results, I conclude that consuming coffee does cause people to think and behave angrily. Based on this, I could have made a type 1 error, and I could have been correct. So your results, you can always be correct. That's an option. You can always be correct. In this case, what I did is I rejected the null hypothesis. I said, hey, this is what's going on. This is actually happening, okay? When you do that, you can only make a type 1 error. You can't make a type 2 error when you say the null hypothesis is lousy, my hypothesis is good. More on the null hypothesis coming up in just a second. 18. Okay, same scenario, except now I conclude that consuming caffeine does not cause people to think and behave angrily. So this is not the same as the last question. This is when I conclude that it does not cause people to think and behave angrily. Based on this conclusion, I could have been correct. That's one option. Or I could have made a type 2 error. In this case, I failed to reject the null hypothesis, and so I could have made a type 2 error. More on null hypothesis in the next question. Number 19. I want to see if consuming caffeine causes people to think and behave angrily. The statement, so this is the statement we're trying to analyze. The statement is, consuming caffeine does not cause people to think and behave angrily. That is the null hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that it does make you angry, and the null is that caffeine does not. It has no effect. Null. It has a null effect. When we do this in science, we either reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. We don't go out and say we proved something to be right or wrong. We can just have evidence that the null is supported or not supported. So rejecting the null hypothesis means that my hypothesis is being supported. In this particular case, if I go out and say, yeah, if you drink caffeine, it's going to make you more angry, then I have rejected the null. Remember, the null is that nothing's going on. I'm rejecting that. By saying something's going on, I reject that nothing's going on. 20. All right, so we're going to use this scenario in the next couple of questions. My dog starts acting fearful when he hears the sound of food sizzling on the stove. Okay, so first of all, we know that the action that we're looking for, the response, is acting fearful. He does that when he hears food sizzling on the stove, because when he was a puppy, something sizzling on the stove started smoking, set off the fire alarm. So what happens here is that puppies naturally get scared of loud, scary noises like fire alarms. And what this particular puppy has done is the puppy has paired fire alarm and the sound of sizzling with that fear response, okay? The fire alarm naturally causes the fear response, but the sound of sizzling naturally does not cause a fear response. So in this case, the sound of sizzling before we accidentally set off the fire alarm is a neutral stimulus because it shouldn't have any effect, right? It's a neutral stimulus. Like the bell was with Pavlov's dog, this sizzling is neutral, shouldn't have any specific response. 21. My dog starts acting fearful, same scenario as the last one, but now the question's different at the very end, the very last part. The sound of sizzling after we accidentally set off the fire alarm is now the conditioned stimulus. It starts as neutral, but then after it gets paired with the fire alarm, and now that it causes the response by itself, it is the conditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus after the pairing happens. So the sound of sizzling used to be neutral, now it's conditioned. Before this instance happened, it was neutral. After, it's now conditioned. 22. All right, same scenario. Now what we're going to do is saying acting fearful is the action. It's the unconditioned response when it happens because of the fire alarm. It's the conditioned response when it happens because of the sizzling sound. So it is both the CR, the conditioned response, and the UCR, the unconditioned response. It has to be. The behavior has to be both. It is, it's the UCR when it happens because of the unconditioned stimulus. It's the CR when it happens because of the conditioned stimulus. That's what we're talking about. 23. Inattentional blindness is caused by cognitive load. When you're not paying attention to you're not clear what's going on, right? You can't see the gorilla walking through the scene. That's because your cognitive load, you're thinking about something else. You're under cognitive load. 24. The more time you spend working, sitting in a chair, the shorter your life. So more time in a chair, less life. As one thing goes up, sitting in a chair, the other goes down, lifespan. That's a negative correlation. A negative correlation is as one thing goes up, the other goes down. Positive is as one thing goes up, the other goes up. 25. Which of the following is a part of behaviorism? There are three things here that are part of behaviorism. Thorndike's law of effect. That's the puzzle box with the kitten, right? Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a part of behaviorism. That's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, that stuff, shaping. That's all operant conditioning. And learning theory. Learning theory is an example. Behaviorism is an aspect of learning theory. So learning theory is part of behaviorism. Operant conditioning is part of behaviorism. Thorndike's law of effect is part of behaviorism. Availability heuristic is not part of behaviorism because it's not based off of rewards and punishments. It's just based off of cognitive accessibility. And phrenology is when people think they know your personality based on the bumps in your head. That has nothing to do with anything. 26. Blank memory is the memory system that appears to have the shortest duration of storage. That's sensory memory. Sensory memory only lasts for split seconds to up to a couple of seconds, not very long at all. Sensory memory is the memory system that has the shortest duration. 27. In the context of shaping, which of the following relates to differential reinforcement? Differential reinforcement is when you give different amounts of a reinforcer. So if I'm trying to get somebody to do something, to learn a new behavior, that is shaping. That's what we're talking about. That's shaping, okay? When you do this, when they get to the actual behavior you want, you give them a lot. You give them a lot of reinforcement, a lot of the reinforcer. That is differential reinforcement. Little steps, little reinforcement. Final thing that you want, final behavior you want, you give them a lot more. That is differential reinforcement. 28. I didn't study enough for this exam, so this morning I decided to go volunteer at a soup kitchen. That is an example of self-handicapping. You're like, wait a minute, that's a nice thing to do. Well, self-handicapping just means you have an excuse for not doing well at what you're being evaluated at, right? So I'm glad that you're volunteering to soup kitchen, but it's not going to help you on the exam. Actually doing something so that you have an excuse for why you might fail, that is going to be self-handicapping. It doesn't matter if it's a nice thing or a mean thing that you're doing, it's still an excuse. 29. I used to have a crush on a girl who wore magnolia scented perfume. This is true, actually, by the way. Years later, I walked under a magnolia tree and instantly thought of her. This is due to all of these things. By smelling magnolia, and that made the schema of her, right? So she was connected with that scent of magnolia that was made more accessible. Making something more accessible is called priming. And the thing that made it more accessible is the state that I was in, state-dependent memory. That memory came back, was more accessible because of the physical state I was in. So all three of those things are correct. 30. I ran a study that showed that watching cat videos led to lower self-esteem. I only ran this study in a lab. I'm worried that it may not be true in real life. That worried that it may not be true in real life is a problem with external validity. External validity is this valid external, outside of the study situation, outside of the lab? So this is a problem with external validity. 31. In a correlational study, we measure at least two variables. You got to at least measure one and measure another, right? You measure and measure. You measure at least two variables. 32. In an experiment, we manipulate an independent variable and we measure the dependent variable. In an experiment, you have to manipulate the independent variable and you have to measure the dependent variable. That is what an experiment is. You manipulate independent variable, you measure the dependent variable. 33. Which of the following is an example of classical conditioning? Okay, now classical conditioning is when something, the response, the behavior that you're trying to elicit, that's a natural behavior. It's just happening for an unnatural reason. Operant conditioning is when you get a brand new behavior. So in this particular case, you got to think of a behavior that the organism naturally does. So for example, do canaries normally say thank you? No, they don't. They don't normally do that. So it can't be classical conditioning. Can a pig play chess? Well, pigs don't normally play chess. Dolphins don't normally backflip in the wild. Do I learn to play violin just out of the womb? I start playing violin? No, none of those are instinctual or natural. Correct answer is I now flinch every time I hear the song Happy Birthday to You. Flinching is a natural response, an instinct. It happens naturally. Humans don't have to learn how to flinch. In this case, the learning was flinching based off of Happy Birthday to You. 34. Which of the following could be the UCS in the Garcia effect? So the UCS is the unconditioned stimulus. Garcia effect is a form of classical conditioning having to do with food, right? Creating food aversions. So in this particular case, the UCS is the thing that naturally causes you to feel sick. It's the natural thing that causes you to feel sick. And the virus is the thing that would naturally cause you to feel sick in this scenario. 35. A double-blind experiment takes care of demand characteristics and Rosenthal effect. Demand characteristics is when the participant acts a certain way based off of what they know about the hypothesis. So if they don't know what condition they're in, they're blind to it, then they will not, the demand characteristics should not have an effect on the study. The Rosenthal effect is when the researcher has certain expectations and treats the participant that way based off of their expectations. The placebo effect, however, the placebo effect is just the normal expectation that the person has where they actually believe that something is going to happen. So double blind is not going to take care of the placebo effect. You have to actually use a placebo to get rid of the placebo effect. 36. Which of the following is most related to automatic processing? The Stroop task is most related. That's when you are reading a word of the color, like Green, and then you have to tell me what is the color of the font. So I see the letters Green, but they're written in red. I would have to say red. Okay, that's the automatic processing, is you would automatically see the word and you want it to be the same color as the font. This goes against it, so this is related to the Stroop task. 37. In order to make sure that your independent variable is actually causing the change in your dependent variable, random assignment. That's when you assign people to either a control group or an experimental group. So for example, if I was trying to figure out whether or not caffeine caused you to be angry, the assignment would mean I would randomly assign people to either get caffeinated coffee or decaffeinated coffee. That would be random assignment. Random sampling is just how you get people. Sampling is how you get people to be in a study. To be random, you'd have to randomly get them out of the population, which is extremely rare. So random assignment is what is really going to make sure that it's the caffeine in the coffee that's causing the change versus something else. 38. B.F. Skinner studied rats in the Skinner box. He'd probably interpret his finding using the learning theory. B.F. Skinner was a major behaviorist. He was all about behaviorism, and behaviorism is learning theory. Learning theory, rewards and punishments. 39. All right, we read a study about the testing effect. I don't know if you remember this one. Students either had to study and then study some more, or they studied and then had a pretest. Then at the end, everybody had a final test. Okay? Which is true of the results? The students who studied and then were tested did better on the final test. The students who studied then studied more were actually more confident, but they didn't do better if that test was later on. 40. I believe that John's from Nebraska because he wears overall and likes cows. I'm from Nebraska. I mean, I like cows fine, but anyway, this is representativeness heuristic. If you are basing something off of a stereotype, if you're making a decision based off a stereotype instead of other base rate information, that's called the representativeness heuristic. 41. I want you to think about Democrats, so I start talking about donkeys and the color blue and Bill Clinton. This is an example of priming. Priming is making something more accessible. So Bill Clinton, donkeys, the color blue, those are all part of the schema that you have about Democrats. And so the more I talk about them, the more accessible the schema of Democrats becomes. Making something more accessible is priming. That is what priming is. 42. Which of the following is a primary reinforcer? Primary reinforcers are things that are reinforcing naturally. You don't have to do any training at all. So, for example, food, in this case, an apple, is a primary reinforcer, but applause and likes on Facebook and people taking your picture and electric shock, well, first of all, applause, likes on Facebook, people taking your picture, those are not primary. You have to learn something. You have to learn that those mean good things for you. Electric shock is primary, but it's not a reinforcer. It's a punishment, right? It's a punishment. It's a primary punisher. 43. Which of the following is an example of classical conditioning? Okay, you better know that it's you sneeze every time you see a chihuahua. You don't have to teach people to sneeze. People don't normally sneeze when they see a chihuahua. All these other ones are examples of things that happen after that are unnatural behaviors. Classical conditioning is when you do something that you've already learned how to do, but you do it for a new reason. Operating conditioning is when you learn a new skill, something that's brand new. So I've learned to play the violin. That required operating conditioning. It's a new skill. A dolphin learns to backflip. Dolphins don't backflip in the wild. That's a new skill. Pig can play chess. Operating conditioning, because pigs don't do that naturally. Canary doesn't naturally say thank you. All of those are operant conditioning. 44. Which of the following is an example of motivated cognition? The cocktail party phenomenon is an example of motivated cognition. That's when you hear your name or something about you, even though you're not paying attention, and it grabs your attention, right? You start thinking about it automatically. You're motivated to know more about yourself. That's an example of motivated cognition, the cocktail party phenomenon. "45. Which of the following is most likely to help improve internal validity? Random assignment. So internal validity is the independent variable really causing a change in the dependent variable? So for example, if I think that drinking caffeine causes you to become more angry, then internal validity is how much can I be sure that it's the coffee that's causing you to become more angry instead of something else? When you randomly assign people to different conditions, like caffeinated versus decaffeinated coffee, that means that you can have more surety that it's actually the caffeine that's causing the change versus something else. 46. Anchoring and adjustment is a heuristic, and so it is most related to the availability heuristic because it is a heuristic itself. So they're both heuristics. That's why they're most related to each other. 47. Random assignment is used in an experiment and only in an experiment because none of the rest of those has an independent variable. And random assignment means you're assigning people to levels of the independent variable. So it has to be an experiment. It can only be an experiment. 48. NASA stands for National Atmospheric and Space Administration. NASA is an acronym. NASA is an acronym. An acrostic is when you have a whole sentence, like please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Okay. Chunking is when you start to put whole things into chunks. In this case, this is an acronym. It's not a chunking, right? The more appropriate one would be acronym. 49. Learning styles are preferences. There's no real evidence that they actually are abilities. They're not heuristics. They're not, so no, there's just a preference that you have. Just a preference. 50. I hate Fred. Fred sends me chocolates in the mail. I think to myself, that's exactly the kind of thing I would expect from Fred. He's always trying to buy people's affection. I hate Fred. That's an example of confirmation bias. The behavior, him giving me chocolates, is confirming what I already believe about him. It's confirming the bias that I already have. Okay, thanks everybody. You can take this again later if you want to. You can test, but I promise you these are exactly the kinds of questions you'll see on the exam because these were questions that I've used on the exam. So make sure that you're studied and good luck.